Do you have the option to blur the back of your?
I don't know.
Okay. Just with all this stuff, I don't want anybody to
Oh, well,
get upset about it.
I'll look and see if I have options here.
So my mom uses Zoom, so what are you looking for?
I was just gonna, is there some way to blur the background? I know some of this, the hunting trophies and stuff might offend somebody or something like that.
Oh, if you, well, you're in camera, right? Are you sharing your screen?
Yeah.
I don't know how to do it from a share screen if the, if you're, yeah.
Well, they might have to just deal with it for now or
I
something.
mean, I don't mind it.
Okay, since you're my only participant, you don't mind it. I think we'll be okay.
You're okay. It's a very, tell your sister it's a very nice buck on the wall.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, let me see. What do I do now? Share screen again, I guess. There we are. Okay, so let's go ahead. You had some questions about this assignment. So let's see here. There we go. So, UDisc, Kishwaukee, syllabus. Let me see, UDisc. Oh, there's my back and stuff buttons. Weird. Okay. Syllabi, course essentials, document. Let's look at the analysis. Okay. So are you seeing this displayed on your screen now?
No,
Oh.
I'm still seeing you.
Okay. Let me see if I can get back to my share space here. Okay, so I want to stop share there. And then I want to share screen, but I want this. Okay. Can you see it now?
Hold on, give it a second. Yes.
Okay. So for this assignment, the analysis project, which will be the next one for our course, you can see that the format is about the same. Regular size fonts, regular MLA certifications that we discussed in the video from Tuesday. The one difference here is that you need to find one professional or one personal citation that you can use for context for this particular assignment. And let's take a look at the descriptor. Obviously, it's 850 words, so that's not quite 4 pages. It's a little bit more than 3 pages though. So rather than say 3 1/4, I just said 3 1/2. It's probably gonna be closer to like 3 in a paragraph or 3 1/4 on the next page.
Okay.
Again, Kishwaukee, along with their agreement for NIU, is more interested in a word count than a page count. So they have a stipulation for all of us teaching composition so that students are responsible per semester for a certain amount of words as opposed to pages. So I kind of, I'm forced to format that, in words, and then it's difficult to estimate what page length that is, because it's never just an even amount of pages. So that's my best estimation.
Okay.
So for this particular essay, as it says here, the world of our novel, Ready Player One, contains a vast cornucopia of popular culture from the 1980s, the world of the Oasis creator James Halliday's youth. Your task for this paper is to develop a review of a single piece of pop culture. There's a lot to choose from here. And in a real broad sense, you could select an album, a film or television show from that period, a piece of art. And with art, I'm expanding that to including anything that might have to do with visual arts, obviously, but then clothing or fashion from that era, toys or games. All of those would kind of fall under like a general, real broad art heading. You could select, by contrast, a novel, or if you're sort of a technological person, you could pick an invention, or even discuss an innovation. Or
An
maybe,
NES.
yeah, absolutely. I've had that project a number
Way too much work.
of
Pick one game.
Right, fair enough, fair enough. But yeah, the idea is to deepen your knowledge about the world from which the Oasis is derived, since it's such an important part of the novel. And of course, if advisable, or it is advisable, if it is also possible, because it's not always possible or convenient for students, but you may consult your parents or your grandparents or guardians to enlist their expertise to complete the project. But once you select the artifact, the steps are pretty easy. You can simply, of course, like we saw with the RMX16 in our past session, you can just start by describing the artifact in question. So if it's a work of art, you might want to use your thesis to explain why it remains relevant today. Or if you selected an invention, by contrast, you may want to explain the importance of said object, and develop at least 3 distinctive criteria that you can use to evaluate the artifact. In other words, what are the points of evaluation that you are using? For your criteria, you may want to select from some of the examples, but I've tried to, in each of the criteria topics, highlight what I think all students should include in their analysis, whether or not it applies to your, whether or not they all apply to your specific topic. So you at least want to pause long enough to explain what makes the artifact essentially of the period. Then after that, it may depend on what your specific topic is, but generally speaking, you might want to ask a question about who or what company created this artifact, how successful was it in achieving its goals, and what factors contributed to its relative success or failure. Then I would pause long enough to explain whether or not the subject appears in the novel or is referenced by the characters. And then if it does, how is it referred to? And this is a little bit of inventive material that you can work with. If it doesn't appear in the book, not everything's going to be in the text, I would invite you to speculate on how you feel the characters may have interacted with it. So a little bit of speculation that you can use for this particular assignment.
Question.
Yes.
So I know what I want to do. My question is from, because we're only on chapter 8.
Yeah, by the end of the week, you might be to chapter 12, but go ahead.
Is Zelda in the book?
I'm trying to remember, and here's the issue with Nintendo, since you brought up Nintendo. Nintendo apparently, and this is something, a conclusion I've reached after several students have done multiple versions of video games. While there are allusions to a lot of the things that happen in their games or a lot of the kind of distinctive elements, they have a very tight control, Nintendo of America and the Nintendo Corporation, of their product. So I guess their licensing and leasing is very strictly monitored. So I don't think Nintendo or specific Nintendo games are mentioned in the book. And in fact, unless Nintendo is licensing and the product or the media itself, I don't think they allow that. So I don't think Zelda is explicitly described in the book, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be explicitly described in the novel. You can still do your paper about it.
Has anybody else done Zelda?
I'm trying to remember if they've done Zelda or not. I don't remember it very clearly if they have. And we've done this assignment 2 times a year for the last 2 years. So I would say you're probably in fairly safe, maybe even new territory if you would like to do a paper about Zelda.
Okay, because I was going to say that is, I believe that's officially the very first game that came out that had save files.
I think you're right, yeah.
Which is like revolutionary for the time, and everything nowadays is dependent on the idea of having a save file.
Yeah, so I think that'd be a really good pick.
Okay.
And then in the conclusion, of course, we take the regular steps that we always take for any essay. You restate your thesis and maybe readdress or just remind your reader about what the essential criteria for its evaluation were, and then try to create a memorable closing. And I kind of wrap that up by mentioning 4 or 5 specific closing techniques that may work for you. It's nothing that I don't think is nothing too revolutionary. A famous quotation, joke, slogan, so on and so forth. Echo a line from the first paragraph. Use a sentence composed of 1-syllable words, maybe to grab the reader's attention, things like that. Set up the ending of the discussion by linking the object to a larger context. Conclude with a sentence that's compound and parallel structure, something along those lines. So that is that's a little bit about that paper. And I know you were curious about some of those elements.
Well, right, just because we had an assignment that was due that required us to write a paragraph about it, but we had not discussed anything about the paper whatsoever.
Okay. Maybe I'll post a special extra video when we're done today with our session so that any student that's like is in a similar or curious circumstance might be able to access that. But I'm glad that you asked that.
Yeah, and if you could just let her know that we haven't even discussed it because it was due yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
So she might extend the time frame. Because, I mean, it's kind of weird to write a paragraph on a paper you know nothing about or a topic you know nothing on.
Right. Okay, yeah. Well, I'll definitely reach out to her about that.
Okay.
So, and that was part of what we were going to talk about today. What would make a good topic for the analysis essay? And so at least you and I had a chance to talk about that. Just backtracking a little bit, did you have any questions about MLA or APA citation or quotation styling?
No.
Okay. So the other two things that I wanted to talk about were these issues about turning an obsession into a gift. So one of Wade's gifts that we explore in the context of the novel is the fact that he is able to generate a certain degree of interest related to and specifically derived from his interests or obsessions about Oasis creator James Halliday. So let me start with a question. Have you ever found yourself in a position to match a research topic to your own unique interests? Have you ever been in such a situation where you've got a project and you're actually able to match up something that you're interested in and write a paper about that?
This paper.
Okay. So
I absolutely love Zelda.
Okay, fantastic. So that's a great experience for a lot of students. And I know that some students have even explained in the lead up to this course that they're comfortable with research as long as they have some degree of autonomy in selecting the topic. And I think that that's really important as well, because research is something that we have to do in pretty much every academic field at some point or other. Eventually, we're all going to have to complete a research project. And completing that research project is so much more interesting and so much more applicable to our goals when we can match up our interests and help that innate curiosity drive us forward to create a good product. So I hope that this project offers you such an opportunity. Marcellus, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, man.
Okay. Same question for you. Have you ever had an opportunity to, sorry, I'm adjusting this camera. Have you ever had an opportunity to match up your interests with a paper topic before?
I don't really think so. A lot of the topics, like in the past when I would write for school, it would be within like a certain category, and you would be, I mean, I guess I could pick within that category, but never just like, hey, I can pretty much write about whatever I want to write about. No, never really had that.
Okay, all right. I mean, even for this assignment, there are some parameters. I've tried to make them as broad as possible. And and I think that that's probably true of the majority of the papers that we write. We have some degree of choice over what it is we're going to, task ourselves with, given, the structure of the classwork. So if we were writing a paper in biology, I'd like to write a paper about Dracula, but that doesn't really have too much to do with biology. But, if someone said you could write a paper about bloodborne pathogens, maybe I could, parlay some of my interest in that field into a reasonable paper for that particular subject. The same thing is said here, is the objective here. Find something that compels you to go forward with your writing, so that the process allows your instinctive and natural curiosity to drive the engine of what it is you want to research. I think if you do that for this initial analysis project, the process will be very familiar by the time we get to our final essay, which is the argument. Because the argument just extrapolates bigger themes that we're discussing from the book out as potential topics for a longer term paper that you might want to write. Speaking of, this chapter introduces us, or this week's readings introduce us to the character of Artemis. So I believe it's in chapter 7 that we finally meet her for the first time. Does that sound correct? Is it chapter 7? Yeah, okay. It's chapter 7, and then she's sort of fully fleshed out, so to speak, in chapter 8. But chapter 8 or chapter 7 is where we meet Artemis for the first time. So I want to spend a little bit of time briefly just discussing Artemis, and then a little bit of time talking about H, which is the individual's name. It looks like Aech, but it's Aech. And it represents literally the letter H as the first initial. So if you've seen the film, there are a little bit of spoilers ahead, but in case you haven't, I'm not going to talk about H too much. I want to talk about H as a character in the context of how Wade makes friends and relates to people in the Oasis, and specifically how their relationship is different from the relationship that we see brewing between himself and Artemis. So first of all, what or how would you categorize Wade's relationship with H? And I'm going to start with Madison, since Marcellus, you and I were just talking last. So Madison, what's your initial response? What's his relationship with H like?
Kind of. Okay, they're friends, but they're not really friends.
Okay.
They're kind of sort of like acquaintances. They know about each other. They talk to each other. But they don't really care about anything else going on in each other's lives.
Okay. You've identified a couple of key things. Those are some good observations. I would agree that H and Wade are very private about their lives outside of the Oasis up until this point. Wade does speculate that H may have a rough upbringing because he never talks about what life is like on the other side of the screen. So I would agree that Wade is certainly private about his life as regards H's interaction. And I think H is just as equally private. However, it's interesting that you said that they're kind of friends, but they're also competitors, I think. And this is a unique characteristic that defines, I think, male friendships a little bit differently than the kind of romantic relationship that Wade is hoping to spark with Artemis. So let's analyze that for just a moment. Before we move on to that, though, Marcellus, what are your thoughts about the friendship between Wade and H?
Yeah, I mean, they seem like within the Oasis, especially, they seem like, they're friends and they get along, but they do, like you said, they seem like they're competitors, almost kind of rivals in a sense. They both kind of are very knowledgeable about Halliday and his, his life pretty much, and what he liked and his interests. Yeah, they just seem, they're friends, they get along, they kind of take up for each other, but you can tell that they're rivals and they want to be better than each other. And H is better as far as a character. His level is better than Wade's. His higher level, yeah.
Absolutely, yep. Within the context of the Oasis, he's achieved more in terms of building his, I think they call it like a leveling up, just like you might level up in an RPG. As you said, he's a higher level of expertise than Wade is. This leads to, that's almost a perfect segue, so that's great. Because this leads us to the first revelation about where to find the first key. So unlike the film adaptation, the challenges happen in 3 sequences, right? So number 1, you have to find the location of the key. Number 2, you have to find the location of the gate. And 3, you have a third challenge to complete. So the first thing that we're told is that a long time ago, a forgotten gunter, a forgotten egg hunter, discovers the first clue, the first rhyming clue. And Wade is fortunate enough to piece together the idea that you have to, the person pursuing the key is also in pursuit of knowledge. And it's in his Latin class that he realizes Ludus, the name of the school planet where all of the Oasis online schools are housed, is also the Latin word for learning. And interestingly, it's also the same word that's used as to play, the verb to play, or to play a game. And so he begins to look at Ludus, and it's on this home planet, the school planet of Ludus, that he discovers some unusual topography, so unusual landscape. And it's a landscape that is modeled very closely on a Dungeons and Dragons module. So today I want to talk a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons. And there's a video that if you're interested in this sort of thing, you may watch it at the conclusion of the course or when you have time, but you're not required to look at it if you're not interested in Dungeons and Dragons. But I think it's only important to look at this challenge in the context of the novel, because one of the things that Ernest Cline does is that he builds the novel sequentially on 3 different levels. And I find it more than a little bit curious that the first level of gameplay goes back to an RPG or role-playing game, a tabletop game in this case. So the module in question is the Tomb of Horrors. And when he discovers the Tomb of Horrors, he gets to interact within that in a 3-dimensional manner. So my first question is, have either of you ever experienced Dungeons and Dragons or have any background with role-playing games?
I literally just played like a 3-4 hour session yesterday.
Oh, wow. Okay. Excellent.
We're playing Tomb of Annihilation
Okay.
currently, which is based off of Tomb of Horrors,
Hmm.
where it's really interesting to note that Tomb of Horrors specifically is meant to be a slaughter run.
Hmm. What now, for those of us who are a little bit unfamiliar, what does that mean?
So literally it's a game where the DM or the dungeon master or GM, game master, sets you through, and their goal is to slaughter all of the player characters.
Oh, okay.
Completely and utterly kill them. And so you have to keep creating new characters, and the challenge level for it is extremely high because you literally step in the wrong place or do something wrong, don't make a throw on the dice, and you're literally dead.
Oh, okay.
So it's a good first challenge because, you know, it's a murder pit.
Okay, that's really interesting because even that description helps me. I'm not someone who is a big gamer, so I had to do a lot of research when I was initially reading this book to sort of understand the context of what was happening. But I have played certain video games. And one of the things, interestingly, that we were talking about earlier in today's session was, Madison, was your interest in the game Zelda. So I think by this point, at least, a lot of people are either familiar with franchises like Zelda or maybe even Final Fantasy in the video game realm that use a lot of the in-game mechanics that originate from these tabletop playing experiences. Now, one thing I will suggest is that I was, at least in terms of my knowledge, which is again admittedly cursory, I found it very fascinating to note that a lot of these games began as games related to war. So a lot of primitive tabletop playing games began with miniatures that recreated famous battles throughout history, and that groups of people would assemble to watch this process unfold, or to participate and fulfill one company's role within the context of a larger battle or a larger war in a historical context. But after a while, repeating these kinds of things became boring. So that's where tabletop innovation took over. And we saw the development of modules that were specifically more fantasy-based or lent themselves to these kinds of fantastic endeavors. And this in turn leads to tabletop gaming. Now, tabletop gaming in America, at least, and I think that's important to note because Ernest Cline is an American writer, and so his context is going to be defined a lot of, well, most of the time by his experience. So his context changed, would be different, say, than an author working in a different, country, for example. In any
I
event,
would like to point out, sorry to interrupt. I would
Okay,
like
go
to
ahead.
point out the people I played D&D last night, 2 of them were from Germany,
Hmm.
one of them was from Denmark, and the other was from the UK. So D&D is international.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that's unique about the international marketplace is that in terms of the historical appearance within a culture, it pops up in different places at different times. So in America, the highlighted area, or the area of the most popularity, was in the mid to late 70s to the mid 80s. Now, this is important in my reading of the text only because the tabletop, the height of tabletop gaming fascination sort of comes to a crescendo at the same time that we see the rise of video games. And it's not too surprising that especially computer-based video games, as opposed to console games, incorporate a lot of the same mechanics and elements for their stories. Later in the novel, we're going to read about an earlier video game called Zork, which is a kind of game where you write. It's a text-based adventure game. And text-based adventure games are an interesting hinge element that joins tabletop or fantasy gaming to video gaming. And you can even see some of these parallels getting played out in, again, games like Zelda, games like Final Fantasy, where they're incorporating the elements that existed for years before in these tabletop games as playable elements. Now, Marcellus, I think I heard you say, speak up a little bit or agree. Are you familiar with Final Fantasy or any of those types of role-playing games?
Oh yeah, I'm a huge fan of Final Fantasy and just games in general. So yeah, I know about all that. I'm not really. I know of D&D, like Dungeon Tabletop, RPGs, but I haven't participated in it.
Yeah,
like that.
I empathize because there's a lot there that perhaps can be culled out from that experience, and it's something that I am not as familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So I that's when I appreciate the input of students like Madison, who has a little bit more practical application of this sort of thing. So Madison, anything else there that you picked up in your reading, or that any other insights to share about how these games are linked to the evolution of video games that maybe we're missing, or that you would like to add?
Well, I would like to point out that there are quite a few of the original video games were actually heavily based off of Dungeons and Dragons.
Mhm.
There's actually, I think, one of the very first ones. I can't remember what it's called. Uh, um, yeah, no, literally there was one in 75 that was called D&D.
Okay.
And it is, like you said, it's text-based, with some images, but it's literally that was some of, yeah.
And it's interesting because I think
It created this game that's literally called D&D created the idea of bosses.
Right. And that's something that is played out in just about every genre of video games today. So if you play Mario Brothers, for example, you know that at the end of every, 4 levels, you're going to have to face off against a version of Bowser or the evil dragon monster to save someone. Frustratingly, it's not usually the princess until 8-4, right? But the boss battle, which again comes from these D&D modules, these Dungeons and Dragons modules, make their way all the way into current video games. The only version where I can't think of a specific boss are relatively new games or sandbox games like Fortnite, and maybe even versions of the Call of Duty series that happen exclusively online. There are certain challenges that you have to meet in order to advance or build up your characters, your avatars level of training or success. But I still think that generally speaking, the idea behind bosses or boss battles does kind of come from some of these original elements from tabletop gaming. So yeah, that's a good connection to make, Madison. Marcellus, any other connections you can think of? Even from like Final Fantasy to today's gaming or other.
Oh, well, just like you said, I mean, there's, the idea of a boss is everywhere in video games. Leveling up, for that matter, is in, like you said, Call of Duty. When you go online and, you kill a certain amount of people, you get experience points and you level up. Even in single player games, you get experience points to level up your character and get better weapons and, to make things easier. So you're right. It's something that has been probably implemented in a lot of games today, and it's shown, it's here to that style and some of its, elements permeate through gaming today.
I think that's a good way to say it. Yeah. Last but not least, I just want to touch briefly on a topic that I'm sure that you're both aware of, but in case your fellow students who are watching this in the future may not be as aware, let's slow down for just a minute in terms of thinking about the text and explore this idea of names. Because every character in the novel has a virtual avatar, a version of themselves. So H, we already talked about. It's the literal initial H that represents his first name, which he decides is best kept a mystery. And it kind of becomes a fun point of contention between Wade and H. But in the virtual sphere, Wade has a very specific avatar, and his avatar's name is what?
Percival,
yeah. Or he pronounces it sometimes as Parzival. but I'm glad that you said Percival, because it's easier to launch into the explanation. So Percival is one of the knights of the Round Table from Arthurian mythology. So as that character evolves over time, the name Percival, if you go back further, especially in some medieval contexts, it's pronounced as Parzival, and that's where we get the unique Z spelling. It's from a German version of the story. So put that in one column over here for a minute. And then let's talk about Art3mis. Who or what is Art3mis?
It is a female avatar that hosts a blog in the Oasis, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, she's relatively popular, at least among like Wade and his, cohorts, at least, but I'm sure she's just popular around the world anyway. I believe she has like raven long hair and stuff like that, and yeah.
Yeah, all of those things are exactly correct. She is a popular female avatar, and I like that you said that she's a popular female avatar, because most of these characters are meeting in a virtual realm. So one of the early ideas that we see sprinkled throughout this novel is the concept of identity. One of the things that makes the Oasis compelling for Wade and for all of the other players is not only the fact that it is the ultimate form of escapism. Escapism, by the way, just as a reminder, from a world that is in economic and financial ruin, economic, ecological, and financial ruin. But it's also a space where these characters inhabit a skin that represents themselves. It might not be representative of how they were born or to what conditions they live in currently, but it represents who they are in a more intrinsic way, more truthful way. So I think one of the things that's very interesting about a character like Art3mis is the fact that she represents this analogy to the Greek pantheon of mythology. So do either of you know who Art3mis was or what role she plays within the Greek pantheon?
She's the goddess of the hunt.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And virgins and childbirth. Mm-hmm. And I think mothers, not mothers.
The moon, maybe?
Yeah, the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she runs around with her immortal hunters, and if any man sees her, she turns them into animals.
Yeah. So she's got kind of the mythological character of Art3mis has a kind of a complicated relationship with men, to say the least. But what's interesting is that the person on the other side of this avatar is very aware of all of those things. And so she chooses this figure to represent who she is in terms of the hunt for the Halliday's Easter egg and erstwhile control of the virtual environment. So I think that all of these little moments, these little beats in these early chapters are representative of multiple layers of meaning within the text itself. And I really appreciate that you both picked up on some of those elements, because I think Klein, our author, really does want us to be aware of them. Now, it's interesting by the same token that Wade picks Parzival as the name of a Arthurian knight, but he does so because he encounters that through Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So he's a little bit less aware of, I think, how deep some of these resonances can go, even though he's our primary author, right? All of the information in the story is filtered to us, the reader, through him as the narrator. So not everybody, excuse me, not every level of insight that we can glean as readers is accessible to him as the narrator. So in some ways, we read around the story that he creates for us. Before I conclude, I wanted to mention just a couple things, but I want to pause to see if there are any final thoughts about that idea from either of you.
Oh no, I'm good.
Okay. Madison, anything?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So one of the things that I found fascinating is that while I had about 3 weeks between the end of the last spring semester and the start of the summer semester. And of course, during those 3 weeks, there were moments where I indulged in Facebook, kind of to placate, limited bouts of boredom. And for a while, I think it was about 3 weeks ago now, so say mid-May, people started to create avatars on Facebook. And it was in my area, at least, my group of friends on Facebook, it flared up for about a week. People were creating their own avatars. And this is old news, okay? But the fact that it occurred and became very popular or spiked in popularity for a bit during this pandemic where so much of our lives has been forced online, I thought, I've got to mention this to my students because it's truly bizarre. Sometimes life and art cross over in ways that you might not expect. And this is certainly true of my experience. Did either of you create an avatar or did any of your friends create these avatars?
No.
Okay. Well, just taking a shot in the dark. I thought it was a really interesting phenomenon, especially in context with the film that had come out and then the original book. Who knows? We may be creating avatars online in the future.
I mean, I have avatars in the online D&D game that I play, and I have avatars in every D&D game I play, and then, like any game where you can customize your character.
Sure. So this is something for us to consider and think about in preparation for tomorrow's session. Does the Oasis and the ability to kind of tailor your look and your avatar to your personal preferences, does that provide some sense of safety or maybe even closure for individuals? Is it a safer, more realistic environment in some ways, even though it's a virtual environment? Are there truths that you can access as an avatar that you can't access in real life? I don't know. I don't expect an answer today, but that is certainly something that I think I would like you to consider in preparation for tomorrow's session. The other thing I'd like you to think about is the Jasmine Fox article, Is Social Media Killing Our Social Skills? So we'll talk about that and more when we get together for tomorrow's session. Okay, thank you so much for joining me. And if you are watching this in the past, make sure that you're getting online and participating in this week's discussion forums so that we can add to the conversation in that format as well. Thank you so much. This is Mr. Fowler signing off, wishing you a pleasant day and an even better tomorrow. Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Oh, sorry.